It is so good to be back. We are, again, in chapter 9, Perek Tes and Shmuel base. We are picking up from here. When we last left off, David HaMelech is now the established king of Israel, and he had done such a great job that he was under the impression that his next thing to do was to build a temple. But sure enough, the prophets tell him that it's not going to be done through him. It's going to be done through the son that will be born to him, which we know is talking about Shlomo, Solomon. So therefore, what we have now is David going on to other duties that are less pressing, but also important. And in the next 2 chapters, he's going to take care of some personal business. In chapter 9, he's going to fulfill the covenant he has with Yehonatan, Jonathan, who is now deceased. He's no longer alive, but David promised, and he made a covenant with Jonathan to take care of his descendants. So David's now in chapter 9, he's going to search for descendants of Jonathan and try to do good for them. And in chapter 10, he's going to try and return a different favor for the king of Ammon, to the king of Ammon who had protected David's only remaining brother. So we're going to get to that, and that's actually going to backfire. It's going to be the onset of a war. But in chapter 9, we have David looking for the offspring of Jonathan. So let's dive in. Maybe it's better if I just summarize it quickly. David's going to search for a survivor of the house of Shaul, a descendant of Jonathan, and he pays him back. And so he ends up finding this man called Tziva, who is a Gentile servant. It's an Eved Knani. The truth is that sorry about that. Resume our learning. So David's going to look for a descendant of Shaul. He ends up of Shaul. Yes, he ends up finding a man named Tziva, who is a servant in the house of Mephibosheth. Interesting name. Mephibosheth was a crippled son of Jonathan. You might recall from a few chapters ago, when the news of the death of Shaul and Jonathan came, the caretaker of Mephibosheth ran. She was startled that she ran and she dropped the child. I think it says there he was 5 years old, if I'm not mistaken. She dropped him, and that made him cripple. He could not walk, or couldn't walk properly. And so the man Tziva tells David that there is in fact a living descendant, and David then promises to give him all sorts of gifts, and he ends up moving to Jerusalem, and David kind of rearranges the structure there in the home. So we're going to learn about that right now. Let's dive in. So again, this is chapter 9, Perek Tes. Vayomer David says, Achi yesh od asher notar leveit Shaul. Is there anybody left in the house of Saul? And I will do for him kindness, esemo chesed ba'avur Yehonatan. On behalf of Jonathan, I'm going to do for them kindness. So this actually, on the outset, we're seeing two amazing things about David.
Okay.
Yeah, you're back.
I bet he could work this Zoom thing better than we do.
Welcome back. Thank you. I was having audio trouble. I switched computers. I think we're all clear now.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that. So here's a remarkable thing. The opening verse of chapter 9, we already see something beautiful about David. What is David looking to do? He's trying to pay back a covenant that he has with Jonathan, with Yonatan. And in order to do that, he's searching for anybody in the house of Shaul, which means he's willing to expand the terms of the covenant. I'm not just going to take care of Jonathan and his descendants. I'll even take care of anybody from Shaul's family. Again, showing the righteousness of David and how he was not jealous whatsoever and had no hard feelings towards the person who had chased him to kill him for 2 years, which is Shaul. So David says, is there anybody left from the house of Shaul? I'm going to fulfill my covenant that I have with Jonathan. And so sure enough, the verse tells us in Pasuk Beis, Uleveis Shaul Eved Ushmo Tziva. The house of Shaul had a servant, a slave, whose name was Tziva. And they called this servant over to David. And the king said to him, Vayomer HaMelech Elav. And the king says to him, are you Tziva? And he says, I'm your servant. Vayomer HaMelech. You'll notice whenever David speaks to this servant, he is referred to as the king, which we assume means that he took on a kingly posture and he was speaking with great authority. It might be significant here specifically because Tziva, Chazal tell us, was not such a nice guy. He actually tried to disparage his master several times when he was talking to David, and it could be David was purposely trying to appear as an imposing figure to try to tell this guy, don't mess with me. Yeah. Secondly, we're also going to notice the contrast between the way David speaks to this servant versus the way he's going to speak to Mephibosheth, which is going to be in an amazingly humble fashion. So David says in verse number 3, Vayomer HaMelech, the king says, Ha'efes od ish levet Shaul, is there anybody left in the house of Shaul? And I will do kindness for him. So the Tziva responds, there is a son for Jonathan, Necher Raglaim, and he's crippled. So why did Tziva say that he's crippled? It could be that he was afraid that if David sees this descendant as a potential successor of Shaul, meaning that he could be a king, then he's going to kill Mephibosheth and anybody associated with him. As a regular king would do, anybody who's a threat to the throne or pretends that he should be part of the throne, just wipes them out, kills them. And if everybody's assuming here that David's a regular king, they don't realize that he's here to do chesed in earnest. So Tziva says, yeah, we have a descendant, but he's crippled. Like, he's not fit to be the king. Don't worry about it. So the king says to him, Eifohu, where is he? So they tell him he's in Beit Machir ben Amiel below Davar. He is in the house of Machir ben Amiel, and the last words in Pasuk Dalet are below Davar. Chazal say this is either a proper noun, Lo Davar, an interesting name for a city. But Chazal also say you could read it as Lo Davar with an aleph, that when Tziva told David about Mephibosheth, he said, below Davar, he doesn't have anything going for him. He has no wisdom, nothing to be impressed by. That Tziva had disparaged his master Mephibosheth. And when David eventually meets Mephibosheth, he's going to discover that he's actually quite a learned person. And the name Mephibosheth means from his mouth comes shame, because David was regularly shamed by Mephibosheth in learning. A person feels embarrassed when you don't know something you're supposed to know. And on a regular basis, Mephibosheth was reminding David of Torah that he felt he should have known, and he felt shame. So we see that Tziva here presented Mephibosheth somebody who didn't know anything, and in fact it was just the opposite. Welcome to the Lombardos. Welcome on. Okay. Verse number 5 in chapter 9. Vaishlach HaMelech David. So David sends Vaikacheu mi Beit Machir ben Amiel, and they take Mephibosheth from this place, and he comes to David. Vaipol al panav vayishtachu. And when Mephibosheth arrives in front of the King David, he falls upon his face and he bows down as a sign of honor to the king. And it could be that the Navi here is stressing that he did it immediately because he might have been afraid that the king views him as a threat. There's a question to be asked over here. David is searching for a descendant of Shaul, and he eventually finds one. The Malbim asks, what do you mean? You're part of the family. Michal is your wife. Michal is Shaul's daughter. These are your brother-in-laws you're asking about. Like, you don't know anything about your brother-in-laws, what's going on with your in-laws? You don't know if there's any living descendants? Shouldn't you know these things? You're part of the family. That's the Malbim's question. So for some in-law relationships, it's not a question at all, right? Because they're your in-laws, you keep a distance. But that's just a joke, or a half joke. Yeah. The Malbim suggests that they were all afraid, and they went into hiding. Nobody really trusted David's motives. They didn't really trust that he was so pure-hearted. As much as he kept convincing people, they were afraid. And aside from that, even if David himself was earnest, the people who surrounded him were not so much, right? If you recall, Ishbosheth, the other son of Shaul, was assassinated. And the people who surrounded David were not so wholesome. They were always trying to cause a ruckus here, to protect David's honor. So, in other words, Shaul's descendants went into hiding. and they had to be tracked down, and that's what happened over here. So when Mephibosheth arrives, his first gesture is to bow down in submission and humility, to show as if like I'm not trying to challenge your throne, nothing. I am your servant. Vayomer David Mephibosheth, and David asks him, "Are you Mephibosheth?" And he says, "Here is your servant. Here I am." Notice here a beautiful encoded message in the text. When David is speaking to Mephibosheth, it does not refer to him as Hamelech, the king. He's referred to as David. This is one of the ways the Navi imparts lessons, is not just the sentences, but even the words, the usage of the words here. The fact that it's switched from Hamelech, which is the way David's referred to consistently here, it switches to David. It's teaching us that David showed humility when he was addressing Mephibosheth, that he didn't want to impose his authority over him. He was here coming as somebody who's paying off a favor to an old friend. Vayomer lo David, again, David says to him, verse number 7, Al tira, don't be afraid, implying that Mephibosheth was afraid. I'm going to do kindness with you because of your father. And he says to him, I will return to you all of the fields of Shaul, your father. And you will always be a guest at my table. You're always going to be eating from my table. I'm going to take care of you financially. You're supported by me from here and forward. Amazing. David did two things. Number one is he gives a gift to Mephibosheth, all of the fields of Shaul. Number two is he's saying, I'm going to support you. You can rely on my table. I will take care of you financially. I've got you taken care of. You're going to eat on my table. Amazing, right? Mephibosheth just struck the lottery. He was a crippled man hiding, and instantly he just became the king's best friend, showing the amazing trustworthiness of David is going to pay off the covenant. Let's focus on that first thing for a moment. David says, I'm going to give you all the fields of Shaul, your father. So the commentaries ask, what do you mean? If the fields are Shaul's, then Mephibosheth is the rightful inheritor, the rightful heir, right? So why does David have to give it to him? It doesn't belong to David. Who is David to give something to Mephibosheth if it already belongs to him? That's the question. Is that clear? I hope so. The question is, how could David give Mephibosheth the fields of Shaul? Don't they already belong to Mephibosheth, who was the descendant?
But they really belong to the king, right?
Again, can you say that again?
They really belong to the king, not to Saul.
Excellent. This is, I believe you just said the approach of the Radak, that we're talking here not about the personal property of Shaul, but there's things that are part of the king's estate. Yeah, like his toothbrush, he comes into the position with and he leaves with it. And that goes to his children. But there's certain things that come just with the position. And those things should go down to David, and they did. But David says, I don't want to keep this. This belonged to Shaul at one point. I'm going to give you those fields, which is incredible. Incredible things that really fairly belonged to David. He was saying, since Shaul was associated with them and he used them, I'm going to return them to you. An amazing gesture. The other option, interestingly suggested by the Mefarshim here, is that Shaul had forfeited his property, or really Shaul's descendants. When Shaul died, David became the official king. And when Ishbosheth took the throne on his own, that's really rebelling against the king. It's treason. And if somebody who commits treason, all of his assets could be seized. So really nothing, even if it already belonged to Shaul, it really now belonged to David because of that violation. And David is returning. That's the approach of the Radak. It gets into interesting technical questions of if Ishbosheth was never tried for treason and never convicted, did that really work? And other interesting side questions like that. Yes, go ahead, Mr. Fox.
Yes. The root of the word Bosheth.
Yeah. Yes.
Why do both have it? Why does Solomon have it and his grandson has it?
Good. I a few weeks ago, I wanted to delve into this. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky. I just turned around because I keep his book right over there, but it's upstairs because I was looking into this question. Boshet, is it just a coincidence like that they have this word over there? So he suggests, I'm trying to recall, unfortunately the book's not here. I don't want to butcher it and embarrass myself, which is the word boshet. Let me get back to you about that, okay? God willing, and Blineder. Either I'll do it in the class next time, or I'll send you a private
Because I
message.
get very confused with the names. So,
I know they're the same word, just a different prefix.
right.
Ish boshet or mefi boshet. Yeah,
Okay.
good question. Thank you for raising that. I'll get back to you, Blineder. Okay, so he gives him the fields of Shaul, and he says, "I'm going to support you from here and forward. Don't worry about anything," which is an amazing gesture. By the way, how old is Mephibosheth at this point? So he was 5 when he became crippled. That's the day that Jonathan and Shaul died. Following the death, there was 7 years where David reigned in Hebron. So that makes him at least 12. And then the events of the previous chapters, there was a couple of wars, you'll recall, with the Plishtim and other. So you can assume that took a little longer as well. So you're talking about somebody who's no longer a young child. Back then, 12 was already in adulthood. I mean, he was beyond 12 at this point. He's mid to late teens, or maybe even older. Okay, so we're talking to an adult here, Mephibosheth. Okay. Verse number 8. Vaishtachu Mephibosheth, upon receiving news of this great gift that David will do for him. Vayomer me'avdecha, he bows and he says, "What is your servant? Kifanita elakelev hameta asher kamoni, that you've turned to a dead dog like myself." Amazing. Mephibosheth so humbled. He was completely overwhelmed by this kindness. He was expecting to be killed, and now just the opposite. A pop quiz for you, a nice riddle. We've seen a few times already people referring to themselves as dogs. Apparently, this was a common thing, that like a dog is like a useless creature or valueless. People, several times we've already had this expression, "Am I like a dog?" So, and here he's saying, and certainly, I'm like not just a dog, I'm a dead dog. Like, and you're giving me such honor. That's a riddle for you. We won't pursue it now. On your own time. Okay. And now the king calls Siva. I see it switches back to king because he's no longer speaking to Mephibosheth. He calls Siva, that servant that we were dealing with before. And he says to him, anything that belonged to Shaul and all of his household, I've given to the son of your servant. Mephibosheth had a son whose name was Micha, with an aleph. Not to be confused with Micha. Okay. So he says to him, your job is to take care of the rest of the stuff. You're no longer tending to Mephibosheth directly. Your job is to take care of the rest of the stuff. And you should work the land, you and your sons and your servants. Even the servant had servants. I assume he was like, a project manager, and he had employees working under him, but all to serve the household. So he's saying, you and your sons and your servants, you should take charge of taking care of the estate of Shaul. And Mephibosheth ben Adonecha yochal tamid lechem al shulchani. And he's just clarifying the terms. And Mephibosheth's going to eat on my table. And now it tells us Siva had 15 sons and 20 slaves. Okay, he had a tremendous family. 15 sons and 20 employees. And this is verse number 11. This is an interesting, a bit of a confusing verse. It says, Siva says to the king, Kechol asher yitzaveh Adoni HaMelech et avdo. I will do like everything that the king commands his servant. I'll do everything you said. Ken yaseh avdecha, so shall I do. U'Mephibosheth ochel al shulchani, and Mephibosheth will eat on my table, like one of the sons of the king. So, Mephibosheth is not eating by the servant's table; he's eating by David's table. So Rashi says you have to cut the pasuk. You have to make a full stop and David starts speaking in the middle of the sentence. In the middle of the verse, you switch to David. Meaning Tziva says, I'll do everything you say. And Mephibosheth will eat on my table, that's David speaking. You split the pasuk in half like that. Which begs the question, why was it written this way? Why it was written as if Tziva was saying the whole thing, that Mephibosheth will eat on my table. Why did the Navi write it in such a strange way where we have to insert like a full break and change the speaker?
That happens a lot in Tanakh.
That's true. That's true. It does happen frequently. But I think still, even if it happens frequently, every time you have to ask, why is this happening? Because there are many ways that the Navi is conveying lessons. Here, there seemed to have been a bit of frustration on the part of the servant. He didn't want these terms. If you think about it, he's being downgraded right now. He was previously serving the head of the household, Mephibosheth, and now he's saying, Mephibosheth's going to stay here in Jerusalem with me and the king, and you go take care of the estate over there. He's getting like demoted almost. And Tziva, who Chazal tells us was a chutzpah, he was trying to kind of fight back. He said, no, I could take care of Mephibosheth. He'll eat from my table. And David said, no, he's going to eat from my table. Right? So Tziva was hanging on to his own honor. That's what the pasuk perhaps is hinting at. Okay. The verse finishes off the chapter verse number 12, I think. Mephibosheth ben Katan, Mephibosheth had a small child. His name was Micha. And all of the house of Tziva were servants to Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth sat in Jerusalem because he was a cripple. He couldn't go back and forth. So he just stayed there in Yerushalayim with David, where he would constantly eat v'pisach derglav, and he was unable to walk with either of his legs. Okay. Maybe we'll jump ahead a little bit to the next chapter. This is a fascinating one. I think we'll just give it a broad glance, if that's an expression. Next thing. Okay, so chapter 9, David was trying to pay off personal debt to fulfill the covenant he had with Jonathan, and he's successful. He finds Mephibosheth, the living descendant of Shaul and of Jonathan specifically, and he promises this tremendous kindness. You stay by my table, and I'll take care of your fields. Good. And again, Chazal tell us that they had a long-standing relationship, that they were constantly learning together, and David was regularly being embarrassed and shamed by the Torah knowledge of Mephibosheth. That's his name was Mephibosheth. From his mouth comes shame. Okay, now chapter 10, David tries to settle another account, and it completely backfires. It says, it was after this that the king of Ammon died. Ammon was out in the east by the Transjordan, or the border of the territory of the Jews. And the king there, you'll recall his name was Nachash. So Nachash died, and his son, Hanun, succeeded him. Nachash, although he was an awful person, as we know from earlier, he threatened the Jews a great threat, and there was actually a war, etc. But he did do a great favor to David. David's whole family, when they were running away from Shaul, they all hid in the territory of Moab, a different place in the east. Moab very cruelly murdered all of David's family. There was one person who escaped. Was it Yehu? One of the sons of David escaped. 1 second. Elihu, the last surviving brother of David, escaped, and he ran to Ammon. And over there, the king protected him. So David felt grateful for this. So he wanted to send condolences to the son of the king who had just died, and he was going to send a gift. Condolences and a gift, because David had personal gratitude. He had a personal debt of gratitude to this king for taking care of his brother. So David says, I will do a kindness with Hanun ben Nachash, just like his father did for me a kindness. He took care of my brother, Elihu. So David sends people to comfort him. And the servants of David come to Eretz Bnei Ammon. So now they enter enemy territory. They travel east. They leave Yerushalayim. They go over the Jordan into the territory of Ammon. And nobody believes it. The princes of Ammon say, David's honoring you. Come on. "Hamechabed David et avicha beinecha." Do you really think that David is honoring your father? That he's sending you people to console you? This is insane. What kind of king would do such a thing? Right? Nobody believes David's motives. As much as he's pure-hearted, nobody could believe it. It was so unusual, apparently, and so uncharacteristic of a person in power to have such kindness.
Right.
So what's his real motive? He wants to spy out the land. He wants to take over our territory. He wants to expand his boundaries, and he's coming here to snoop out the land, to spy it out. That's what he wants. So they take the servants of David, they take the messengers, and they humiliate them. They shave off half of their beards. And they cut their pants in half as well. They cut off half their beards and half of their pants, their lower garments. And then they send them off. They say, get out of here. The Nazis in the Holocaust, this is something that they were known to do also. On numerous occasions, we have accounts that they would tear out half of the beard of a Jew just to embarrass them. Now, Ammon here might have had another thing that was tricking them up. It says in our Torah that, first of all, the Ammonites and the Moabites are not allowed to marry into the Jewish people. And furthermore, it says, Lo tidrosh shlomam v'tovatam kol yemei chayecha le'olam. You may not seek out their peace. It is forbidden to make a peace treaty with Ammon. Ammon knew our Torah. They knew that the Jews would not accept them as into their. They would not accept them as converts. They would not let them marry into the Jewish people, rather. And they knew that it's forbidden to form treaties with them. So now the Jewish king is sending over emissaries in peace. They say this can't be. He's violating his own Torah. It can't be. Now, if they were more learned, they would realize this is not a violation of that verse, because this is a personal matter between David and the king of Ammon. He's not making a national peace treaty between the two groups. He's just repaying a personal favor, and he wanted to say condolences. They're going to be Menachem Avil. It wasn't this major peace treaty. But they suspected David because, first of all, they're projecting their own character on David. And secondly, they realized that the Torah does not allow for such peaceable relations between the two nations. So they end up humiliating the servants of David.
But it's interesting that this kind of behavior was evidently goes all the way back to this point in history. Yeah.
The Nazis had not so many chidushim. They people were anti-Semitic for a long time, and even that specific behavior of shaving the beards or half the beards, they didn't make it up. Yeah, they say like father, like son. Anti-Semites. So David hears word about what happened, so he says, "Okay, you should stay in Yericho, shvu b'Yericho, ad yitzmach zekanchem meshavten." Until your beards grow back, you should stay in Jericho. Jericho, your call was right when you cross over the Jordan. It's pretty much close to the border of the Jordan River. So he said to them, "Stay there until your beard grows back." Now one could ask, why don't they just shave off the other half? So the Radak says that the Jews didn't go clean-shaven back then, and it would be even more humiliating to be totally clean-shaven. So they had to wait like several months or however long it takes for the beards to grow back to an extent where they wouldn't be ashamed anymore. Now Ammon is in trouble. They realize that they just overreacted and they poked the bear. The Jews are extremely powerful. David is a very successful military leader. And now Ammon is terrified that they just provoked war. So they hire mercenaries from the north. They hire 3 different armies from the Syrian area. It tells you their names here, Aram Beit Rechov, Aram Tzova, and Melech Ma'acha and Ishtov. Oh, it might even be 4 armies. Yes, they hire Aramean mercenaries, and they say, okay, come, let's go fight against those Jews before they come to attack us. So it says in verse number 8 in chapter 10, Vayitzu bnei Ammon vayarchu melchama petach hashar.
And what happened is Aram, that's the actual nation that's in control here, they're fighting close to their city so that they can run back to their fortified city just in case. And the mercenary, the hired armies, are all out in the open. David sends Yoav, the general, the Jewish general, with the strongest soldiers. And in verse number 9, he's surrounded. He realizes he's surrounded by armies. So he makes a strategy, and it's interesting, but we're not going to delve into the details here. He makes a strategy. He divides the army into two groups. One is going to fight against Ammon, and the other will fight against the rear. So you have Yoav and Avshai working together. And they make a plan. He says, if I start losing over here, then you come support me. And if you start losing, then I'm going to go support you. So they divide. Interesting line here in verse number 12. Chazak v'nis chazek. V'nis chazak, rather. What we say at the end of reading the Torah, we say chazak v'nis chazek. Here is a place in Tanakh where it says that. Chazak v'nit chazak be'ad ameinu. Let us be strong and rejuvenate our strength on behalf of our nation. The Gemara in Brachos says from this verse that anybody in any profession should constantly renew his vigor and needs chizuk. It says derech eretz, which is a person's livelihood, is one of the 4 things that requires constant re-strengthening. Rashi says if you're an artist, I think he says, some sort of craftsman, then you should strengthen yourself there. If you're a soldier, you should strengthen yourself there. Because, I don't know what it means. Maybe it means like going to seminars or trying to get yourself motivated. You have to reinvest yourself in your profession regularly, chazak v'nit chazak, in order to be successful. So here they're kind of pumping themselves up. And they're saying we're going to fight on behalf of the cities of God. B'Hashem yaseh atov beinav, and let God do what's good in his eyes. A sign of beautiful humility. As much as they're motivating themselves to fight, they're also accepting whatever fate God decides should be the result of the war. We'll take it. Sure enough, the fighting starts. Vayanusu mipanav, and in verse number 13, they're already running away. The Arameans flee back to their city. Uvnei Ammon ra'u ki nas Aram vayanusu mipanei Avishai evo ha'ir. So one of the enemy armies sees that the enemy is running away, so then the others start running away, right? They just set off a chain reaction. Even though they had tens of thousands of soldiers, they were terrified in their heart of David and his army. Actually, David was not there. It was Yoav who was fighting. David purposely didn't go out to this war. ArtScroll says, I didn't see any other explanation. He didn't want to give them the satisfaction of having roused the king himself. So he sent the general with his army. Okay, so in short, they make a battle. Eventually, David goes out once the initial battles are won. In verse number 18, we could just wrap it up here. Vayanas Aram mipnei Yisrael vayarog David Aram 700 rechev v'arba'im elef parashim. David again goes up to do the cleanup work, and he ends up killing 700 chariots, which might be 7,000 people if each chariot is 10 men, and 40,000 horsemen. That Shovach starts of Ohika vayamot sham, and he killed the army general. Vayiru chol hamalachim avdei Hadarezer ki negafu lifnei Yisrael vayashlimu et Yisrael vayavdum vayiru Aram v'Hoshea od et bnei Ammon. So all of the subjects of Hadarezer, one of the hired kings, saw that they were defeated by Israel, so they made peace with Israel and became subservient to them. They said, "Okay, we quit. We say uncle," and they became subservient. Aram became afraid to save the children of Bnei Ammon any longer, and all of the hired help basically said, "We quit. We're not helping you with this fight anymore. Leave us out of this. Let the Jews alone." Okay, so here we have 2 chapters where David's trying to take care of personal accounts. Number 1, he wants to fulfill the covenant with Jonathan. Check, he did that. Number 2, he wanted to say thank you to Nachash to express his gratitude, and that did not go so well. They suspected his servants of espionage. They cut off half their beards and half their pants, and that actually initiates a war. They hire tens of thousands of soldiers from the north, but nevertheless, the armies of David are able to defeat a decisive victory they have over the enemy, and the hired help, the mercenaries, quit, and they say, we're not going to start up with Israel anymore. The next chapter we learn, Perek Yud Aleph, is going to be the story of David and Bathsheba. God willing, we'll get to that next week. It's a very interesting chapter, very challenging to work out what was going on beneath the surface over there, and I look forward to learning with you next week, God willing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach.
Thank you, Yasher Koach.